Hello, I'm Luke Ross from MixingLight.com and welcome to the 6th insight in this Baselight Beginner video series. So today we're going to have a look at the Scene Detect tool. So this Scene Detect tool is more for the workflows that are maybe a little bit faster turnaround. You don't have time to conform using an EDL and sync check and to sort of go back and forth. The editor's given you a high-res, high-quality codec file. You just want to get into grading. This is where we use the Scene Detect tool. The first step is to go up to our Flux browser and import the clip that we want to bring in and cut up. So I'm going to go up to my views, go down to Flux Manage, and you can see I've navigated through my RAID to my proxies folder, and I've got a Scene Detect file here that I'm going to use for this tutorial. Now, if you want to follow along with me during this insight, you can go ahead and download the Mother Died project off MixingLight's website, and you can use the same media that I'm using as we go through these insights. It's a great idea to click this file and just make sure that your resolution, your codec, your color space is all correct before you get integrating your project. So you can see here I've got a ProRes codec, it's full HD, and it's been tagged as Rec 709. Most QuickTimes will automatically tag as Rec 709, so if you're expecting a different color space here, that's not the end of the world. But definitely if you were expecting a UHD clip or a ProRes HQ file, and you're not seeing that here, that's when you can close Baselight, send an email to your editor and get that sorted out quickly. For now though, we're going to go ahead and double click our clip, or we could go ahead and hit Insert Sequence at Cursor. It's going to prompt us to change our scene container, and we'll go ahead and change that to our RAID. We'll close Flux Manage with Control B. Cool. So as you can see, we've got a sequence here. It's all in one file, and we want to cut this up into various shots so that we can grade it. The first bit of housekeeping though, when I import a file straight from Flux Manage, you can see that the file name is just the full file path of the clip. Up on the top left hand corner here in the parameters view, we can see that here in the naming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my shots view and rename this file. To get to the shots view, I'm going to go up to my views tab and go down to the shots menu. Now, don't worry, we're going to cover the shots menu in depth in the next insight, so stay tuned for that. But for now, I'm just going to go over to the right-hand side here under the strip name column, select my text here, and replace this with %W and hit enter. This is a Baselight expression, which again, we'll get into in the next insight. I'm going to go ahead, click yes, and now you can see that my Baselight strip has renamed to the file name of the clip. So great. I'm going to go ahead and close the shots view with Control H. And now we've got a really tidy place to start. Second thing to look at is we want to, at this point, make sure that our input color space has been tagged correctly. Especially, as I mentioned before, sometimes QuickTime files can get confused and think that they're Rec 709 when they're not. So for example, if this film was shot in Arri log C, I'm going to go ahead and change this in the input color space tab. So if it was log C, I'd go ahead and change that to Arri log C. As you can see, that is the incorrectly tagged color space, but the Scene Detect tool does rely on the contrast and saturation that changing your input color space provides. So make sure you've selected your correct color space before you use the Scene Detect tool so that the Scene Detect tool has the most information it can to accurately cut your clip. I'm going to go ahead and change this back from log C to Rec 709. Okay. I'm going to go up to the Actions drop-down menu, and you can see there's only one. I'm going to go ahead and click this and make this a little bigger here. So you can see that there's a couple of sliders, a couple of toggles, and a big start button. So let's go through this top to bottom. The first drop-down menu specifies whether you want to apply the Scene Detect to the current shot or a selected shot. So I'm going to leave this on my current shot. Going down, here's the 3 sliders that are sort of the main nuts and bolts for this Scene Detect tool. To start off with, let's ignore the pixel threshold. Let's focus on the cut threshold and the mark threshold. So this Scene Detect tool, it's basically looking for differences within the frame, and it will make smart cuts based on when it thinks the shot has changed. So the cut threshold slider is the main way that we're going to change when Baselight cuts or not cuts. If we drag this to the left, it'll get more sensitive and it will cut more often. If we drag the cut threshold to the right, it'll be less sensitive, so you'll get less cuts in your timeline. Potentially, if we go too high, it'll start to miss cuts, right? So we want to keep this at the right balance, where it's not cutting things which aren't shots, but it's also not missing changes in shot. So you kind of want to experiment with this a little bit, depending on what footage you have, to make sure that you're getting the right balance between the two. So the mark threshold, instead of making cuts, what this tool will do is it will create timeline markers on the timeline. So it won't actually cut your clip. It'll just leave a very clear marker which you can jump to check whether this is a cut or not. So the mark threshold can't actually go higher than the cut threshold. You see when I drag this, it'll automatically bump up the cut threshold. But what I like to do is I like to set this mark threshold quite low, quite sensitive, which means that as the scene detect tool works on my clip, it'll create more markers than it probably should, but then at least I can jump to these markers and just check that my cut threshold wasn't set too high and it might have missed something. So it's a nice way to sort of have your cut threshold set at an intermediate point and your mark threshold set a little bit higher to make sure that you don't miss any cuts. Very briefly, the pixel threshold, you don't really need to touch that. You can think of it as sort of the overall sensitivity slider. So if you had set your cut threshold and your mark threshold all the way down to 0%, you were trying to get it to cut really hard and it wasn't at all, you can go ahead and drag the pixel threshold slider down. It'll make the cut and mark threshold more sensitive to those pixel changes and hopefully get some more cuts. But again, I tend to leave that on the default of 20%. For this particular scene detect, I'm going to leave the cut threshold at 10%, and I might put my mark threshold up at around 2%. Moving down, we've got two toggles, cut at timecode discontinuities and cut at keycode discontinuities. So a keycode is related to scanned film. So if you're working with just digital media, you won't have to worry about this. I'll leave this off. But this, quite self-explanatory, if there's any timecode discrepancies in your file, it will automatically cut. So I'll leave this toggled on for now. Okay, so set our cut threshold slightly lower down at 10% and our mark threshold quite sensitive up at 2%. So let's go ahead and hit start and see what happens. So that looks pretty good. Our single clip has now been cut up into multiple clips. So we're going to go ahead and go all the way back to the start. And you can see that this is a timeline marker that was created, but we've also got lots of cuts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to check the cuts first and then go back and check the markers. It's a relatively small sequence, so it shouldn't take too long. To start checking my sequence, I'm going to hit the keyboard key X and jump to the cut point and just use my left and right arrows to jump one frame to the left, one frame to the right, just to check that the cut is successful. So that's correct. I'm going to jump with X, back, forth. That's good. X, going to jump left arrow key, right arrow key, X, left, right, X, left, right, X, left, right. Okay, so all of these cuts are looking good. Just make sure I haven't missed anything. I can click and drag on my cursor to scrub through the timeline here. Just making sure these longer shots, there's no sneaky cuts hiding anywhere, but no, this looks pretty good. Navigating into my timeline with Command, middle mouse button, drag to the right. I'm just going to go ahead and have a look at this first marker. The shortcut key for jumping to the next marker is Shift X and Shift Z to jump back. So again, X jumps you to the next cut, Z jumps you to the previous cut, Shift X jumps you to the next marker, Shift Z jumps you to the previous marker. I'm going to go ahead and hit Shift X and jump to my first marker here. And as you can see, just tapping through with the arrow keys, this is not a cut. It's detected that as a potential cut and has marked it. If this was a cut, what I would do is click this clip here and hit Command K. So as you can see, Command K splits the clip on the cursor, but it's not. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command K again. So Command K will cut and also rejoin a clip. I can right click this marker and go remove mark from timeline. And I'm going to go ahead, jump to the next mark, Shift X, do the same thing, just, okay, so that's just some more motion. Right click this marker, remove mark from strip, and hit Shift X. Okay, so let's see if there's any cuts in here. Okay, so we went one frame to the left with the left arrow key, and you can see there is a cut point. Let's just scroll through this. Okay, yeah, so that's definitely a cut, and that's quite a subtle cut. I almost didn't notice that myself. That's where having a slightly sensitive mark threshold can be really helpful. So I'm going to go ahead, key back onto my cut here and hit Command K to cut my clip. You can see that the mark vanished when I did that. And I'm going to go ahead and tab over to my next frame. No, This mark actually doesn't look like it's identified a cut, so we'll just go ahead and remove that with right click. Okay, so we've successfully gone through, checked our scene, checked all the markers, and just made sure that all of our clips were cut up correctly. Now that our clips are cut up correctly, we can go ahead, add grade layers, and start to have fun with our clips. So just to recap, bring in your full file from Flux browser, make sure it's correctly tagged in the correct color space, go up to your scene detect tool. Depending on your clip, set your cut threshold at a sort of intermediate level and your mark threshold slightly higher if that's how you like to work, and go ahead and hit start. If any of my clips had multiple color spaces here, say this one was in log C, I could go ahead and just change that on my input color space tab as I go, and now I can sort of adjust clips on a per clip basis as well. Cool guys, that is the insight for today. I hope that was helpful, and I'm keen to get into the shots view with you in the next tutorial. I'm Luke Ross for MixingLight.com.